On the situation in Iraq, we are now joined by Omar Shaukat. He's a researcher at the Afro-Middle East Centre. Good morning and welcome to the studio, Omar.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Firstly, tell us, there are reports of civil war in Iraq. Is that correct? And how bad is the situation on the ground?
The situation on the ground is pretty bad. Effectively, Iraq now is divided between three zones. One is where the Sunni militants are in control. That would be the western and northwestern side of the country. And then in the northeastern side and other northern sections is where they've had a regional sort of autonomous government for a while. And then the eastern side, which is where the Baghdad government is in control right now.
Mm-hmm. Now, the country's prime minister, Nouri al-Maliki, has been blamed for the instability in the country by alienating the moderate Sunnis. What do you make of those allegations? Is that any truth in that?
I think so, yes. To a very large extent, the Prime Minister and the government, he's already served 2 terms as Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. So the government that he's seen in those 2 terms has to take a lot of responsibility for what has happened. So let me give you a couple of examples. In 2006, there was what is now called the Sunni Awakening, which was basically a tribal sort of alliance between different groups to fight off the Al-Qaeda group at that time. And the promise the government made at that time was that these groups who are fighting off Al-Qaeda will eventually be taken into the Iraqi security forces. But that did not happen. And when you have like somebody who's fought a major war, mm-hmm. And you don't sort of incorporate them into the military apparatus, essentially you're leaving a militia behind.
So what are the Sunni militants' demands?
Different groups have different demands.
Okay, so there's different groups with different... Oof, that must be difficult.
Yes, it's quite difficult for us to follow as well. Mm-hmm. So the one group that has been making the most headlines is known as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIS is it's often called. That is probably best described as an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. So it's a Sunni terrorist group in many ways. But then along with those, you have those previous military councils that I was talking about, the tribal councils. They're known as the military tribal unions. You have that. You have ex-military men who were ruling with Saddam when he was, before the US went in and took him out. So you have a bunch of different groups. Now, everyone has a different demand. The minimal sort of demand that they have is for the central government in Baghdad to treat their regions properly. Mm-hmm. The maximalist demand would be to establish something of an Islamic State.
Islamic State, as such. Now, during the U.S. Secretary of State's visit there, John Kerry, he was meeting with the Prime Minister yesterday, and there were reports that Iraq's Prime Minister agreed to a July 1st deadline to begin the process to form a new and inclusive government. Could that be a breakthrough or a game changer?
Potentially, if he follows through on what he promises. The problem has been that, he's made these kind of gestures many times before to other local Sunni politicians, but we just haven't seen anything on the ground. Maybe because of all the attention that this has, gotten, and with Kerry being there, maybe, but, I'm not very hopeful.
Mm-hmm. So how many groups are we talking about? Because it sounds very confusing. I mean, Levant the ISIS is probably the biggest one, and then, of course, how many offshoots are there?
Actually, ISIS is not the biggest one. ISIS is just the one that tends to generate most headlines because it's the most sensational sort of one. Mm-hmm. In terms of numbers, ISIS, before the invasion or before the sort of conquering happened of these cities, probably was around 5,000 fighters. But what they've been doing is, as they go into territories, they capture territories, they release prisoners. So what exactly becomes of those prisoners? Do they get, absorbed into what was ISIS before? If that is what's going on, then the numbers must have increased by a whole lot. We might be talking about more than 10,000. But regardless of what happens with the prisoners, the bigger numbers are presented by the tribal sort of leaders and the people who are following them. So ISIS is not the biggest group.
So it's going to be difficult really to reach an agreement with all of them at the same time. It's going to take some time to...
Yes, I think so. From the government's perspective and international and regional powers' perspective, what they might want to do is show that the Baghdad government is interested in devolution of power, help them devise some formula to curtail Maliki's power. And then that would give them the sort of legitimacy to go, and engage in military sort of attacks again. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be on both fronts, military and political. The political sort of solution by itself is not going to achieve anything.
Mm-hmm. Now, lastly, do you think the United States withdrawal of their troops in 2011 was a bit premature? And can the situation, could the situation have been contained if the troops were still there?
Unfortunately, I mean, the U.S. wanted, and Maliki himself wanted the American troops to leave. If this situation had to be contained, we are basically talking about, massive numbers of troops we've left behind. And then the idea that Iraq is not occupied would not just be true anymore. So, for Americans to be able to contain it, like I said, we would have needed like tens and thousands of, troops. That wasn't going to happen. There was just no, favor in that for that thing, either in the U.S. or in Iraq. If they had left lesser number of troops behind, could they have stopped it? I doubt it. So, in many ways, I think it's the political problems created by the Baghdad government which led to this situation. Militarily, U.S. or not, this probably would have still happened.
So finally, you are suggesting that it should be, in order to resolve this, there should be a hybrid happening between military intervention as well as political negotiations.
Definitely, and on the military end as well, one has to be careful because a lot of the demands of the people who are rebelling is that they've been treated very harshly militarily. So how the military sort of operations and strikes are coordinated and who is being attacked really needs to be sort of surgically performed. Otherwise, this has the potential to get much worse.
Omar, thank you so much. It was absolutely incredible. So that was Omar Shaukat, who is a researcher at the Afro-Middle East Centre, giving us some more detail as to what is happening at the instability in the Middle East nation of Iraq.